Hi, this is Julian for Pro Tools Expert. I've got myself a copy of LX480 Complete by Relab. This is a plug-in version of the Lexicon 480L, which when it was released in 1986 was the ultimate hardware digital reverb. Well, actually, there was only hardware digital reverbs in 1986, but this was the best that was out there, and it's such an iconic piece of equipment. Particularly the Lark, this blue and white remote control we can see in the plugin UI, was such a visible piece of equipment on every console in every big studio for such a long time that a plug-in version is very welcome, and we should have a look around the UI and see exactly what it is that people were using for such a long time. The user interface is heavily based on the original hardware Lark. It's just a cosmetic similarity. If you look at what the buttons say on the hardware unit compared to what these buttons say, they are different, and of course the screen's very different. But it's a familiar user interface, and it's nice to see it represented here. I'm going to do what I usually do when I'm checking out a new reverb and run some drums through it and listen to the different algorithms. The algorithms are accessed from the top right, and this has all of the algorithms that were available on the 480 and some extras. For example, it has Hall, it has Plate Room, it has Random Hall, the famous Random Hall, and of course Ambience, which is the sound of the 80s in a reverb. But it's got some additions. For example, it's got Random Hall HD, which apparently builds on Random Hall and extends it because there were some compromises in the original algorithm based on DSP limitations, and this is no longer necessary in today's computer environments. So we'll just run some drums through this and have a listen to the tails and see what we think. So, looking at the screen, you've got a choice of controlling parameters directly from the screen or using the faders, whichever suits you. For example, if I want to change the reverb time, I can grab it here, or I can control it from here because there's an equivalent control point on the screen. This would be a good time to mention what the buttons along the bottom of the faders do. They offer a compare function, so to begin with, this was 2.3 seconds, I think. It was 2.14, there you go, or back to my edited value. So you can to and fro between your change and your previous state by using these buttons, which is really useful when you're tweaking. But enough about the interface, let's have a listen to some reverb. Here on engine A, I have the default patch, but there are two engines, and in B, I've got a large wood room set up. So we can compare those and listen to one or the other. Default or the room. However, what you can do is instead of going in this either or mode, which we have here, you can run both at the same time. So for example, we can run them in series, one into the other. So A into B would sound like this. Which is dramatically different. Also, we can run one into the other and then cross-mix the outputs. Or feed the left and right into both and then mix the outputs from there. So some really flexible options there. Here's an example of how you can use the different reverb engine configurations. What I've got is I've got two very different reverbs set up on the two engines. On A, I've got this, which is kind of quite a bright room sound. And then on B, I've got this very strong, short ambience. And in this configuration, I can have one or the other, but I can't have both. Here, if I play one into the other, it sounds very different. So I'll do that while I'm passing some audio. And taking that slightly further, if I try the other options of feeding one into the other and then summing the outputs, lots of possibilities for designing interesting dual-engine reverbs there. Something that the 480 was really famous for was a couple of parameters tucked away in the modulation section called spin and wander. These were unique to Lexicon, but you find things like this in most reverbs. If you don't have any modulation in the tails, then what happens is with all of the delay lines, the resonances can build up depending on what you're putting in. It can make it sound quite unpleasant. If you have just chorusing or some kind of similar cyclic modulation, you start to hear that and recognise it, and it can sound a little bit artificial. Spin and wander really nailed this whole kind of modulation on the tails thing, and it's something that Random Hall was really famous for, and it's why it got used as much as it did. It's a great sound. I've set up a couple of examples to show you what this was designed to solve. I'm not going to name the reverb because I've made it sound deliberately bad, so it wouldn't be fair, but I've got a reverb set up with no modulation at all on the tail, and just playing a piano into it, you can probably hear the problem. It's got this kind of like build-up of resonance and gets a bit of a pitch to it, and it sounds quite nasty. And you hear the kind of metallic tails. Here I've got another reverb. This is what happens when you introduce modulation, but you take it too far. This is one of the stock reverbs in Pro Tools, and it's one that works quite well on drums because they're not pitched, but if you use it on something pitched, it can start to sound a little bit all over the place. And listen for the modulation to the pitch on the tail in this. You hear how that pulled upwards. It's way too much. But bring up LX480 with Spin and Wander. And you might be able to hear there's some modulation going on there, but it's not cyclic, predictable, drunken, out-of-tune modulation, and it avoids those builds-up of resonances that can be a problem if you don't have any modulation in the tail. So that was LX480. What do I think of it? There are things about it I really like. I like the ambience algorithm. It's the sound of the 80s for me. It's on drums or on vocals. It's just such a characteristic sound of that period, and it's a sound that you can't easily find in other places. But this is where it came from, so this does it perfectly. The same goes for Random Hall. The Spin and Wander parameters on the tails introduce that modulation, which work really well on pitch sources, and it's a very lush and characteristic sound. There are a couple of things that I'm less keen on. It doesn't seem to support Option Click for resetting parameters to their default values, and I'm very used to that in Pro Tools, so I did kind of miss that. And as for the user interface, it's very, very skeuomorphic, and because of that, it kind of has some of the same disadvantages as using hardware does. For example, you have to go looking for parameters in the same way as you would in a piece of hardware. There are some fun things I haven't shown you. For example, in setup, you can change the look of the interface and do things like this, so it's all covered in coffee stains and things, which is kind of fun, although isn't going to make it sound any better. It's a pity that in the setup menu, there's no option to swap the order of the engines, because I did find that if I was playing with this as a kind of sound designy type thing, sometimes I wanted to change the order from A through B into B through A, and you can't do that. A bit of a small niggle that, but it is something that occurred to me. Overall, this is a great reverb if you like Lexicon reverbs, because that's exactly what it is. So if you want that sound, this is a great place to get it because it sounds like a 480.